So this is happening up and down the vessel. People saying their final goodbyes, trying to find a spare seat. And because the evacuation was so uncoordinated, you had many lifeboats being launched with a handful of people in them, where others were full to bursting and crowds were trying to get on. And this is where it becomes more contentious when you look at the number of people who were saved and also the sort of people who were saved. Because different orders were given to different classes of passengers about where they should assemble, where they should go. Some of this was deliberate, some of this was completely inadvertent. Again, one of the stories that came out of the Titanic inquiries was that the third-class passengers were locked below decks to stop them escaping. And this was brought up on a couple of occasions, with witnesses saying, yes, this happened. But I think there are two factors to this. Firstly, it's true that many of the lower deck passages were locked. The gates were closed. But this was because the order had been sent out erroneously that the areas had been cleared, and so many people were still trapped, having not bothered to leave. Others had never been given the warning that the ship was going down, and therefore it was too late for them to get out. But I think another factor comes to play as well. When you look at the composition of people in third class and steerage, it was where the bulk of foreign-speaking individuals were based, and so they probably didn't hear or understand the orders that were given. Many didn't have a grasp of English. There were dozens of nationalities aboard the Titanic, and over 400 were down in steerage. So I think there's a contribution of different factors going on here. I don't believe, from reading survivor accounts and going through the evidence, that a deliberate attempt was made to lock people below decks. That's just my impression. Other people may disagree. Various social commentators, when looking at the survival statistics, were damning of the White Star Line, of the officers and crew, and in many ways of the whole class structure. H.G. Wells took the print, lambasted the owners, this wanton disregard for human life, elevating the privileged few against the downtrodden masses. He turned it into a form of class war. But I think, as we see with many of the accounts, there was utter confusion. The system of orders broke down. Certain parts followed protocol, others didn't. So it is that sense of confusion that shines through. The confusion, in many ways, that affects even the accounts of the ship's sinking. We have here Bertha Watts, who describes another story. She talks about the orders being given for women and children this way, so we all went over to the starboard side. One boat was on the way down, and one was hanging on its davits overboard and full of men. Looked as if they were steerage passengers, and we heard that they had more or less charged this boat, so that left them hanging there until after our boat left. So people were actually making decisions from third class. The master at arms was standing with a gun at that point. One boat went down ahead of us. Then we loaded into the next. No order. Some people in first seemed to be sitting with feet up on seats, while some of us stood all night. When we women folk got in, all we said to the men was, "Come on, there's plenty of room." But the officer in charge of loading said, "Women and children first." We waited a few minutes and none came, so we were let down. All thought we'd stop at another deck and pick up some more women, but no, we didn't. And I'll never forget the sight of these 3 or 4 men standing looking over the side. One other boat was loading as we left, and the one that was hanging, that was the last. Our boat was in charge of a fine old Irish seaman who did his best to keep folk in line, and he told us that we were almost the last boat off. Soon after leaving, we heard shots. We were told these were fired to make the men come out of that boat. By the time we got out, just a little way up, the Titanic was really going down by the nose. So Paddy, as we called him, said, "Row for all you're worth," or would be drawn in by the suction. 2 stewards were rowing but didn't look too experienced. Paddy asked others to help. We heard cries for help, but couldn't see too well where they were. We possibly were 3/4 of an hour out, and the boat seemed to break in the middle and went in nose and stern in what seemed minutes. Not a vestige of her could be seen. Then all was calm and dark. Up until then, the lights of the ship gave some help, but as she sank lower and lower, row after row of lights would go out. That, remarkably, is one of the only accounts that the boat did indeed break in two as it went down. And it was only when the shipwreck was actually then recovered that we saw that it had broken and had gone in the way that Bertha describes. But the official verdict in the Board of Inquiry that it had sunk in one piece. So it's amazing that amongst all the confusion and all the accounts, you do actually get, ignored by historians and indeed those sifting over the wreckage, the one account, the one kernel of truth amongst that. Her account shows that it wasn't just a simple women and children first, and that there was this disparity between empty boats, people with their feet up. And I think one of the most contentious issues surrounds the owner, Bruce Ismay, who was on board the ship. Various accounts have him dressing as a woman and stowing on board. Others that he was a hero. Depends on who you believe. But we do have some eyewitness accounts about his role as the ship went down. And once again, set to one side what you think or what the historians think, let's have a look at what actually was going on, in the words of those who were there. Shortly, a tall civilian arrived, who we recognised as Mr. Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. He approached a group of passengers near us and told them that they should get into the lifeboats. This was our first intimation that something serious may have occurred. Our lifeboat was comfortably filled when Ismay walked over to us and calmly told us that we should get into a second lifeboat which was being filled. It was swung over to the side, flush with the deck. No one in our group, however, was anxious to obey. The prospect of being lowered some 80 feet or more to the ocean in the dark was not alluring, and we all still felt that nothing so far warranted such a risk. To our minds, the idea of the Titanic sinking was preposterous. It should be remembered that we had read about many of the features of this great new ship, of which not the least emphasised was its unsinkability. No one therefore moved to obey Ismay as he walked off. I could still see no sign of any list on looking down the deck. In a few minutes, Ismay noticed us all standing together. He again walked over and with considerably more emphasis told us we must follow instructions and get into our lifeboat. We were the last passengers on the deck. I told Mrs. Beckwith I thought we should do what he said, and she finally led the way to the boat. Stopping in front of Ismay, she asked if all her party could get into the same lifeboat, and he replied, "Of course, madam, every one of you." We got into the boat, in which all were standing up, and then we hung for probably 5 minutes, during which Ismay was apparently waiting for more people. An officer finally came up to him and said there were no more passengers on the boat deck. Ismay then told this officer to take charge of the boat, telling 4 or 5 more sailors to get in. He then said, "Lower away," and walked off. We apparently were among the last passengers to come up the boat deck. It was afterwards disclosed that all first cabin passengers had been ordered to A deck below, and the stairs to the boat deck had been roped up. This was a dreadful error. The deck was covered. A deck was a covered deck, and the lifeboats lowered to it could only be filled by passengers being helped through its square windows. This created confusion, much wasted time, and difficulty of control. Many lifeboats, not being readily visible from this deck, except through these windows, were apparently lowered half full or less. Had the first-class cabin passengers been ordered to the boat deck, hardly any should have been lost. So there you are. The first-class passengers were given wrong information, and many of those who could have been saved died. But again, it shows you the hierarchical system. Boat deck, A deck, the higher up the ship you are, the more chance you are of getting into a lifeboat. So, what we really see here is a whole range of chaos and confusion and poor decisions, resulting in some boats being left half empty and others being left half overcrowded. Once you were on the lifeboat, you had a far better chance of getting away, but some simply didn't. And there is a remarkable account of vessels being found floating in the ocean up to 4 weeks after the ship had sunk. We have another crew member, George Rowe, writing after the sinking. Another mystery of the sea. After all our boats were emptied, all the lifeboats were hoisted on board the Carpathia, the vessel that eventually rescued the survivors, with the exception of the 2 Engelhart rafts, which are basically flat floating rafts that people could scramble onto and try and float away. They were cast adrift, yet 4 weeks later to the day, Oceanic, sailing nearly over the same course, sighted an object. A boat was lowered, and it was found to be one of our Engelhart rafts with 3 bodies, 1 passenger and 2 firemen in it. So even if you got off, there was no guarantee that you would still make it safely. We have various accounts of the way people met their fate on the Titanic. We've heard about that young lad scrambling into the lifeboat and being ushered out at point of gunpoint, trying to say some dignity before his end. But we have other folk there as well. We have W.T. Stead, the novelist, who rather eerily had written a few years before about a fictional story which involved a White Star vessel which had collided with an iceberg. And then in 1886 it published another article which looked at the loss of a steamship in the mid-Atlantic in similar circumstances. And the loss of life in his fictional article was blamed on a lack of lifeboats. Perhaps he knew what was going to happen, because the survivor's account said, "About the last person I took particular notice of was W.T. Stead, novelist, calmly reading in the first-class smoke room. It looked as if he intended stopping where he was, whatever happened." He literally put his feet up, sat reading the paper, and went down with the ship. We also have an account of Andrews, the naval architect who built the vessel. The man, if you remember, who was in charge of making these economies, but also concerned with making the vessel as good as it possibly can be. He was also instrumental in trying to save the sinking ship, and above anyone else must have known what a hopeless task it was. We have another account from a survivor who had encountered Mr. Andrews going around the ship trying to get people out. Poor Mr. Andrews came along, she reads. "I read in his face all I wanted to know. He saw me knocking at some of the passengers' doors. He said, 'That was right,' told me to see if they had lifeboats on and get one for myself and go on deck. He was a brave man. Last time I saw and heard him was about an hour later, hoping to get the women and children into the boats, imploring them not to hesitate, but to go when asked, as there was no time to be lost. So Mr. Andrews met his fate like a true hero, realising his great danger, and gave up his life to save the women and children on the Titanic." So we have different stories of valentry. We have stories of people quietly meeting their fates. It's a very different time. Again, can you imagine that sort of action today? We hear of ships capsizing and captains scrambling off before even the crew or many passengers have done. 2 incidents I can think of recently in the last few years. What happened to Captain Smith? Well, another survivor sees him staying on the bridge right to the last, and only when the ship finally sinks and the water bursts through the windows of his actual part of the ship, he dives into the water. So we actually have someone who thinks they've seen the last of Captain Smith, again going down with the ship right to the very last. I think perhaps one of the eeriest things was the aftermath of the ship going down. We have various accounts of people who have made it onto the lifeboats and are rowing away as fast as they can as the lights on the boat are going out and it starts to tip ever further into the air and then down. The dear officer gave orders to row away from the sinking boat at least 200 yards. He afterwards, poor dear brave fellow, shot himself. That's an officer on board the ship. We saw the whole thing and watched that tremendous thing quickly sink. There was then terrible, terrible explosions and all darkness. Then followed the awful cries and screams of the 1,600 dear souls fighting for their lives in the water.